Hello and welcome to the first in a new series of Jane's industry-focused webinars where we talk to senior folks from the defence sector looking for their insights into the impact of COVID-19 on industrial policies, procurement and supply chains. My name's Nick Brown and I'm one of the research and analysis directors here at Jane's, primarily responsible for delivering our naval, inventories and strategic weapons content. One of the most obvious impacts of this coronavirus is that we are all working remotely, and so apologies for any background distractions, any sounds that you might hear off mic while we're out of the studio. We've got some great speakers for you on this introductory session. Doug Dixon, the commercial head of our Jane's industry product portfolio, is hosting this first head-to-head discussion with David Trachtenberg, Vice President of the US National Institute for Public Policy. David has over 40 years of public policy experience in the private sector and US government, including serving over the last few years as the Deputy and Acting Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, which made him the primary policy advisor to the US Secretary of Defense. He's held an array of other lofty positions, including overseeing the office responsible for US nuclear and missile defense posture, holding staff posts in the House Armed Services Committee, and a period as consultant to the President's General Advisory Committee on Arms Control and Disarmament. For his part, Doug heads up our Jane's Aerospace and Defense Industry business unit. He's an engineer by background and has personal insight of industry and procurement issues, having started his career with Lockheed Martin and rising to senior strategic roles within Boeing before joining us here at Jane's in 2018. Together, they are going to cover issues ranging from the impact of COVID-19 on US and international industry partnerships, through sharing some perspectives on future strategic directions. After them, Guy Eastman, one of the senior members of our Jane's Defense Budgets team, will put all of that colour into focus, running through the numbers in a briefing on current US Department of Defense spending plans and the impact that he projects the pandemic will have upon them, immediately and in the long term. The full JDB product portfolio covers a macro-level analysis of defence budgets in 105 countries, which accounts for 99% of the global defence spending. Much of that, of course, comes from the United States, and Guy is responsible for all of our North American defence budgets content. He combines an enviably deep background knowledge with perspective from the user and supplier sides of the procurement world, having capped off a successful US Navy career, some of which was spent in acquisition roles, with senior strategic planning positions in several defence primes before joining us here at Jane's in 2011. His defence budget's projections underpin much of our markets forecast content, along with a range of our other products. I'm sure you all know Jane's Markets Forecast, but as a quick refresher, we use a bottom-up methodology to prepare a 10-year outlook of procurement opportunities across 60 countries and 19 individual markets, from military ships to precision-guided weapons and command and control systems, along with pretty much everything else in between. We have over 85,000 individual records in the database, each built from more than 150 elements of data, giving us a total of over 10 million data points. So that's plenty of detail to drill down into. If you'd like some more detail on any of this, please do get in touch by email to inquiries@janes.com or via the website janes.com/marketsforecast. So with introductions done, I'll hand over to Doug and David.
Thanks Nick for the warm introduction, and welcome David. It's great to have you with us here for what will be a series of discussions about COVID-19 recovery and what it really means for industry. So going to cover a range of topics over a couple weeks here around the global defense and policy environment, the industry and supply chain itself, as well as the programs and equipment that deliver the mission. So we all know it's a time when experience and having more trusted sources, they really matter in times like this. So it's my pleasure to have you here, David, to offer some of your thoughts and insights and help steer the course for us for what I think will be, in all likelihood, several years of an evolving situation as we all come to terms with what the future and recovery really looks like. So David, I thought it'd be good just to start us off, just to give you a chance to really tee up the discussion. Any opening thoughts, really what you're thinking about these days?
Well, sure. And I appreciate that very much, Doug. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and share some thoughts. I thought I'd like to maybe start by offering a little bit of context for the discussion and just perhaps frame some of the issues that I think are probably worthy of additional exploration. The first point I would make is that, of course, in the area of national security, the Trump administration's 2018 National Defense Strategy highlights the reemergence of great power competition as the main security challenge that the United States is going to face. And in order to meet that challenge, the U.S. needs to be able to develop and procure highly sophisticated advanced technologies to stay ahead of potential adversaries and emerging threats. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has, of course, highlighted vulnerabilities in the acquisition and supply chains that are necessary not only for the country's economic health, but for its defense and national security as well. In many cases, the commercial industries on which we rely for these advanced technologies and advanced defense capabilities, including from the large defense primes to subcontractors and small businesses, are facing layoffs, furloughs, production cuts, and perhaps worse as a result of the current pandemic. So one concern is how well prepared and equipped is the defense enterprise as a whole to meet the security challenges we face today and are likely to face tomorrow under the kinds of circumstances we're now confronting. In other words, what does this mean for our military readiness, for our global posture, including our ability to work closely with friends and allies around the world? And the answer to that question, I think, depends not just on the ability of the government, but on the ability of the private sector also to work with the government together in order to confront these challenges and deal with various vulnerabilities in the supply chain and logistics and things like that. In addition, and we can get into this later if we have time, but I would also raise the prospect that in thinking about the current pandemic, of course, this is a naturally occurring event. We consider it to be a naturally occurring event. What if, however, this were not just a naturally occurring event, but what if this were the result of a deliberate and targeted biological attack on us, on our friends, allies, other countries? What would that mean? What lessons should we learn from our response to this particular pandemic that might be transferable to a situation where we find ourselves in a perhaps similar situation, but as a result of a deliberate action taken by adversaries or threatening actors overseas? So I mean, these are just some of the questions that I think the current crisis compels us to try to address to see if there are lessons learned that we can pull out of this that are, of course, appropriate as we move forward to deal with the challenges we are likely to face.
Great, that's really interesting, David. So kind of maybe just pulling that thread. So starting where I think we should, which is pivot to great power competitions. How do you see any? I mean, I could imagine a range of outcomes from more substantial policy changes all the way through just maybe how it's implemented, things like stockpiling or some specific criteria. Maybe do you have any thoughts on the kind of potential policy impacts and how you see this maybe playing out over the next year?
Sure. I think there's one particular potentially big policy impact, and that is the issue of foreign sources of supply and how dependent we are on them. One of the things that this current crisis has exposed, I believe, is how dependent we are on foreign sources of supply for pharmaceutical needs, medicines, things like that. In particular, we rely a lot on China to supply many of the medicinal products and pharmaceuticals that we use here, which suggests itself that perhaps we need to rethink how dependent we are as a nation on foreign sources of supply for critical components with respect to our defense establishment. We rely on many allies and partners in the defense area for their ability to produce and contribute to our defense enterprise. That's all well and good when we're talking about the desirability and the need to interoperate with partners and allies around the world in a military sense. But on the other hand, we need to be very cognizant, I think, of whether or not we are risking additional vulnerabilities by allowing ourselves to be dependent on others for critical defense and national security needs. That's an issue that I think really needs to be explored in a little greater detail. We need to strike an appropriate balance between the desirability and, in fact, the necessity, I would argue, of working with others in the defense enterprise for the common security of everyone, and the need to be able to be, if necessary, if needed, be self-reliant on critical defense and technology components that basically fuel our ability to provide for an effective and collective defense.
Great. How do you think that might play out in the next level down, implications perhaps on things like partnerships, co-investment? I'm thinking of the example of programs like the F-35, which are multinational in kind of new and different ways than kind of national interest might really kind of allow themselves to be. Do you see changes as fundamental as rethinking programs such as that, or others, even alliance structures, more NATO, EU level implications?
Well, I think that's a great question. I would say this: global partners, in my view, are essential to American security. There are more than a dozen countries that partner with us, in particular on the F-35 program, in one way or another. And by partnering with others, especially on sophisticated high technology products that will improve our competitive edge, we can distribute program costs more broadly and more equitably. Obviously, failing to do that simply increases the cost to the American taxpayer. However, we do need to strike an appropriate balance that involves others on the one hand, but at the same time preserves our ability to maintain the integrity of the supply chain if political developments warrant. The F-35 case that you mentioned is a particular case in point. As I said, there are many countries involved in producing components for the plane. It's a huge international, multinational effort, which is good, again, from the standpoint of being able to interoperate in a military sense with our alliance partners. On the other hand, we want to make sure that we have the ability to be able to reach back and produce things should the political environment change in a way that poses additional risks to the supply chain. We need to be able to ensure that we have backup capabilities available. And so finding where that appropriate balance is and striking that appropriate balance, I think, is an important consideration going forward. How does it relate to the current pandemic? Again, it relates to the overall issue of foreign sources of supply. How greatly do they permeate the defense industrial base, and is that an appropriate balance or not?
And then the other one to mention there is the cost side, right? It's who pays for the increased cost, or the cost of going it more alone versus in more partnership side there too. And if I kind of tee that up for my own question, I guess, how do you think the cost side plays out? Particularly, the U.S. is in an interesting political cycle, just coming up in an election year. Budget processes over the last, I want to say, decade are notorious for not happening on time. How do you think it plays out? Your prediction mode for this year? You think the budget goes through and FY21 will get passed, or what's your prediction here?
Well, again, a good question. Well, I have to say my crystal ball has been quite hazy of late, so I don't have an excellent idea of how things are actually going to play out. But it's clear that the entire defense budget process has been delayed as a result of the current COVID-19 crisis. Now, there are those on the Hill that are seeking to move the process along as expeditiously as possible, given the current situation and the fact that the Congress, as of today, is not in session. We'll come back, but with all the concerns over social distancing and what have you, it's going to be a different way of doing business. Congressman Thornberry on the House Armed Services Committee, the ranking member, has introduced legislation, for example, to further reform the DoD acquisition process in order to address some of the industrial-based vulnerabilities we face. He's also proposed an initiative, actually a $6 billion initiative, referred to as the Indo-Pacific Deterrence Initiative, in order to counter China by enhancing our presence and our partnerships in the region. All that said, there are significant disagreements that remain between Republicans on the Hill and Democrats regarding overall levels of U.S. defense spending and priorities. And in addition, as you correctly note, this is a presidential election year, and as a consequence, I would expect some additional fireworks, so to speak, over the proper balance between defense spending on the one hand and domestic spending on the other. So if I looked into my crystal ball today, I'd say that I would probably not be surprised if we find ourselves operating later this year under another continuing resolution before an actual defense budget can be passed for fiscal year 2021. Obviously, in recent years, we have lived under numerous continuing resolutions. I expect, unless things change drastically, I expect we may face a situation where we will again have to face at least one, if not multiple, continuing resolutions later this fiscal year, at the end of this fiscal year, before we can get an actual defense budget passed, simply due to the new circumstances under which we are currently operating.
Interesting. Let me just pull one thread there because it piques some interest on mandatory versus discretionary spending and that trade-off that's coming. I think you're right. It's probably not a FY21 question. Do you think it's 2 years, 3 years out? It seems like a big bill to pay. So how do you, in a multi-year sense, think about the trade-offs that are coming?
It is a big bill to pay. I think those trade-offs. This is not the first time we've had to deal with disagreements between mandatory and discretionary spending. I think we're likely to see those arguments and potential disagreements continue into the future, well beyond this year, into the out years as well. Of course, I think some of that is going to be dependent on the outcome of the November election also, and not just the presidential election, but how it affects the power dynamic on Capitol Hill as well. So we may see power centers shift as a result of the election. They may not, but I think we are probably destined to continue to have this enduring debate over the proper division, so to speak, the proper allocation of resources between mandatory spending and discretionary spending, between defense spending and non-defense domestic spending. I think that's a debate that's here to stay well beyond this fiscal year.
I think that's the right point. And I realize we're coming up on time here. So David, I want to say thank you. Maybe give you a chance here. Any kind of closing remarks or kind of takeaway comments you'd like to make?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to share some thoughts with you. The only thing I would say in closing is I'm sort of reminded of an old Chinese saying. We've been talking a little bit about China here. I'm reminded of an old Chinese saying, may you live in interesting times. And we certainly do, to say the least. The question is whether we will draw the appropriate lessons from the current crisis and act on them in order to improve our readiness for the next crisis. The government clearly can't do this by itself. The private sector is an essential partner in this effort. And that's where I think this discussion and the discussions that follow onto this can be most useful in identifying workable solutions to help us, to help allies and partners, to help us all not only successfully emerge from the current crisis, but to be better prepared for what's over the horizon down the road in the future.
Great, thanks, David. And maybe I'll start with my own personal thank you. Thank you for joining us. It's been enlightening. And then also on behalf of James, thank you so much for your contributions here today. And then in the next section, we're actually going to have our colleague Guy take over for a little bit and provide some additional depth and insight into the budget process and what we see coming in some of our products.
Great. My pleasure, Doug. Thank you.
Good day. I'm Guy Eastman, Jane's Senior Analyst. The agenda this morning is basically to cover the COVID-19 impact, to talk about some actions that were taken by DoD, to talk about the response from industry, talk about a little bit about the fiscal year 21 budget and the schedule, talk about the fiscal year 20 schedule. So I'll dive right into it. So COVID-19 pandemic. So the Pentagon has announced that it's bracing for a 3-month slowdown on the major defense equipment that it accepts. Ellen Lord, who is the USD Acquisition and Sustainment, declared that the defense industrial base is a critical infrastructure sector. And basically, we're talking about the survival of the funded, those programs that are funded and those companies that are funded. So the most impacted sectors are the aviation supply chain, shipbuilding, and some of the small space launch sector companies. The DCMA, who tracks over 10,000 prime companies, said that there were 106 companies closed during the pandemic, but 68 companies have reopened after they closed. The DLA, Defense Logistics Agency, also tracks vendor-based companies, and they track over 11,000. So 427 of those companies closed, but 147 of those companies reopened. So a work slowdown has occurred and will continue to occur, and this will have a cost impact later on downstream. The DoD received about $1 billion from the CARES Act, which was signed by the President on the 27th of March. And that basically went to provide medical equipment and medical supplies. So I'll read some statistics here on the COVID pandemic. As of the 26th of April of this year, at the national level, USA, over 957,000 have been infected, close to 54,000 deaths. And at the armed forces level, that is the troops, about 3,900 have been infected with 2 deaths. And of those that were infected, 1,200 have recovered. If you include all of the defense industry, that is, the armed forces, the contractors, the dependents, and the DoD civilians, there's about 6,200 that were infected, 26 deaths. So that's basically the statistics that come out of the pandemic. Now I'll talk about the positive actions that were taken by the DoD. So progress payments have been accelerated in the DoD from 80% to 90% for large businesses and from 90% to 95% for small businesses. Some contract awards have been accelerated by a certain number of months to maintain cash flow for those in the, for example, the shipbuilding area. The Pentagon has announced that equitable adjustments will be made for schedule and costs that the contractors are incurring, and they will be made to contract in due course. The Defense Health Program, which is about a $33 billion program, received a large allocation of operations and maintenance funding, and again, that went to equipment supplies for the medical team. DoD invoked the Defense Production Act, which it doesn't do very often, but it did that for medical equipment from some contractors to the tune of $133 million. DoD is also removing some of the restrictions on other transaction authority, OTA contracts, so that more contractors can work on S&T, science and technology. So DoD is expected to do some reprogramming of fiscal year 20 and prior years in the spring and the summer, and this will alleviate or not have some funding expire in the MilPERS area or training and recruiting. So that will be taking place this year. And then lastly, DoD has provided over 4,000 medical personnel and 2 hospital ships, the Mercy and the Comfort. So now let's talk about the response from the defense industry. Defense companies basically are limiting their overhead and trying to preserve cash as much as possible. Some of the measures they are taking are temporary plant shutdowns, furloughs, layoffs, reduced working hours, and basically cutting some salaries of mainly executives, etc. Some choose to take some vacation or leave in order to avoid risking exposure during the pandemic. DoD is concerned very much about the Tier 3 and Tier 4 small companies not returning to the marketplace after they shut down. So that's a big concern. Some of the primes are stepping up and showing commitment to the supply base by accelerating some of their payments to the companies that provide them equipment and supplies. Most of the primes are operating on-hand stock, but eventually they're going to have to replenish. Unfortunately, some of those companies that do the replenishment are based in Mexico and Canada, and where different trade restrictions occur and different industrial policies. So that could be a problem for some of the primes. There's also a concern by major primes that these measures taken in total may not be enough in the near term operating scenario. Basically, the DoD relies heavily on the Department of State to execute export licenses in order to keep the trade from being disrupted. So that's another reliance that DoD has. So now let's talk about the fiscal year 21 budget and the schedule. The president submitted his president's budget request on the 10th of February of this year during the pandemic. Base budget was $636 billion. Overseas contingency operations was $69 billion. When you add that together, you're at $705 billion for the DoD 051 discretionary budget. When you add about $35 billion to that, which is the sum of the Department of Energy, NNSA budget, and related agencies and mandatory, you get up to about $740 billion at the 050 defense budget function level, which represents a 0.34% increase over the fiscal year 20 budget. I have a chart I'm looking at now that has basically all the appropriations listed. They all add up to that 051 level of $705 billion. If you add the military personnel accounts and all of the O&M accounts, you get 64.1% of the budget is for operations and sustainment. Okay, that's a large value, 64%. And that's near-term funding. If you add the RDT&E and the procurement appropriations together, you get up to about 34.5%, which is the sum of investment or modernization, as we talk about. And that's very healthy over the past 3 years. And then there's another 1.4% for MILCON and family housing and things like that. So that's the makeup of the budget. Congress normally does their markup of the DoD budget in the May and June timeframe. However, Congress is basically at home right now, and not a lot of legislation is occurring. So there's also a presidential election year in 2020, and that election will occur on the 3rd of November. So with all that background, the expectation is for the fiscal year 21 budget that we will start the new fiscal year 21, on the 1st of October without a signed Appropriations Act, but rather a continuing resolution or a CR, as we have done in the past. And this will limit the DoD and the other agencies in how they procure and provide services. So that's not a good thing. So now let's talk a year ago, fiscal year 20, actually the budget that's being executed right now. And there are some long-term budget impacts. So IHS Markit predicts that in fiscal year 20, this year, there will be a 5.4% contraction in the fiscal year 20 U.S. government GDP, caused by the pandemic and also exacerbated by the collapse of oil prices. Prior to the onset of the pandemic, OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, works for the president, expected nearly a $1 trillion deficit in fiscal year 20. With the signing on the 27th of March by the president of the CARES Act, which is equal to $2.2 trillion, and also the Small Business Relief Act of the 24th of April, OMB now expects that the deficit in fiscal year 20 will top $4 trillion and will top $2 trillion in fiscal year 21. Now, under these magnitudes, which are unprecedented, under these deficit spending magnitudes, certainly we will see downward pressure on the defense budget going forward in the future years. Given that the defense budget is over half of discretionary spending for the U.S. government, it will likely be seen as a bill payer for a deficit-driven drawdown. So lastly, I just want to talk about the fact that Janes does track the U.S. DoD budget on an annual basis and forecast into the future. We provide data-driven analysis, intelligence, analytics, and information and news on a daily basis, and we track that through the entire year. Products include both top-down investment forecasting and also with quantities and outlays, and also bottom-up market sales forecasts for 10 years, We talk about equipment descriptions, forecasts, and inventories, and we also have daily news that we provide via Jane's. So that basically is a look at the impact of the COVID-19, and also supplements the interview with Mr. Trachtenberg that just took place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guy, and thank you everybody for streaming this first in our COVID-19 Jane's Defence Industry Conversations webinar series. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope it's given you a hint of the kind of content that we're publishing every day here at Jane's. If you've got any subjects that you'd like to have covered, or if you would like to give us any other general feedback, please do get in touch with us at inquiries@janes.com, and we look forward to welcoming you back to another webinar very soon.